the founding father who betrayed Washington and nearly handed America to the British. But here is what you do not know, and this is the part that will change everything you thought you understood about betrayal, loyalty, and the cost of being a military genius in a revolution that did not deserve him. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, I will show you that the man America branded a traitor was actually the architect of victories so crucial that without them, there would be no United States at all. And the real scandal is not that he betrayed Washington, it is that Washington's government systematically betrayed him first, and nobody bothered to tell the full story. If you have ever wondered about the men who actually won the American Revolution, not the ones the textbooks sanitized, but the ones whose names should matter, subscribe right now. Because every week on this channel, we uncover the forgotten commanders, the overlooked soldiers, the tactical geniuses whose stories were buried by history itself. And if there is a founding father or a revolutionary hero whose sacrifice you think the world forgot, leave a comment below. I read every single one, and your story might become the next video we make. Wait, this part is critical, so I need your complete attention for just a moment. The full mechanisms behind why Arnold was really court-martialed, the secret deals made behind closed doors, the political assassinations that destroyed his character before he ever turned, all of that is explained in depth in our comprehensive guide available in the description and pinned in the comments. This is not a free resource. It is a paid research document that goes much deeper than what we can cover in this video. But if you want to truly understand the betrayal, you need to see the framework that made it inevitable. Now, let us start at the beginning, because the story that matters does not begin with West Point or British gold. It begins in 1741, in Norwich, Connecticut, with a boy named Benedict Arnold whose father was destroying everything the family owned. The elder Benedict Arnold had been a successful businessman, respectable enough in his day, a man of some standing in the community. But he carried a sickness that no revolution could cure, a hunger for alcohol that would eventually devour his entire existence. Young Benedict watched his father collapse into public drunkenness, watched the family business hemorrhage money, watched the family name transform from something that meant respect into something that meant shame. This was not some abstract lesson for young Benedict. This was his daily reality. His father was arrested multiple times for public intoxication. The family's fortune was not just spent, it was squandered on a vice that his father seemed powerless to control. And something profound happened in that young boy's mind. He decided that he would become everything his father was not. He would become disciplined, he would become successful, he would become indispensable. By 1765, Benedict Arnold had not just recovered from his family's collapse, he had completely transcended it. He had apprenticed under his cousins Daniel and Joshua Lathrop, learned the apothecary and trading business from the ground up, and then struck out on his own with a vision that most merchants his age would never have dared to entertain. His shop on Chapel Street in New Haven became more than just a local apothecary. It became the center of a vast trading network that would extend from Connecticut all the way across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, to Montreal, and beyond. Arnold captained his own vessels. He personally sailed routes that more cautious merchants considered too dangerous. He bought rum and molasses from the Caribbean, sold European manufactured goods, and moved horses and supplies through an intricate network of his own making. He was ruthless in business, sharp with numbers, and he had a temperament that could turn volatile in an instant if he felt disrespected or wronged. There was a famous incident that captured his personality perfectly. A sailor working for him spoke poorly of Arnold in a port tavern, and Arnold did not file a complaint or walk away. He challenged the man to a duel on the spot. This was not the behavior of a gentle or even a balanced man. This was the behavior of someone whose pride had been wounded so deeply by his father's shame that he would literally fight anyone who tried to diminish his standing. By 1775, Benedict Arnold was wealthy enough to be comfortable, respected enough to matter in his community, and driven by something deeper than just merchant success. He had proven to himself that he was not his father. He had built something real, something tangible. But success in business had revealed something else in him, a hunger for a different kind of power, a different kind of legacy. Then, in April of 1775, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, and the entire trajectory of Benedict Arnold's life shifted in an instant. The man who had spent 20 years building a merchant empire suddenly walked away from it. He assembled the governor's second company of guards in New Haven, a militia unit he had already organized, and he marched toward the fighting. But here is where the story becomes something entirely different from what most people understand. Benedict Arnold was not just another volunteer who showed up eager to fight. He was a man who possessed an almost supernatural gift for seeing military possibility where others saw chaos and confusion. And in the spring and summer of 1775, the Continental Army was chaos and confusion. It needed someone like Arnold. It just did not know it yet. The first military operation that Arnold proposed would set the entire tone for his revolutionary service. He understood something that very few commanders grasped in those early months of chaos, that the British fort at Ticonderoga, sitting on Lake Champlain in northern New York, was not just a fort, it was the key to controlling the entire strategic corridor between Canada and the American colonies. The British held it with a small garrison, fewer than 50 soldiers. It was garrisoned in a way that suggested the British commanders believed that the rebellion would collapse quickly and that no threat could possibly materialize from the colonials in the north. They were catastrophically wrong. Arnold convinced the Massachusetts Committee of Safety to authorize the attack. He found an ally in Ethan Allen, the leader of the Green Mountain Boys militia from Vermont, and together they launched what would become one of the first successful military operations of the entire war. The significance of this cannot be overstated. In May of 1775, when the Continental Army was still trying to figure out if it actually existed, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen walked into a British fortress and walked out with control of one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate in North America. What made this operation revolutionary, and I use that word deliberately, was not just the victory, it was that Arnold had seized not just a fort, but also the artillery that would become absolutely critical to the Continental Army. There were cannons at Ticonderoga, dozens of them, and in those early months of the war, the American forces were desperately short of heavy artillery. Arnold personally supervised the transport of those cannons down Lake Champlain and overland to Boston, where they would arrive at exactly the moment when Washington needed them most. The artillery from Ticonderoga would contribute directly to forcing the British to evacuate Boston in March of 1776. This was before the Declaration of Independence. This was when the British still had complete military dominance, and Benedict Arnold had delivered one of the first serious defeats they would suffer. But Arnold did not stop there. After Boston, he turned his attention northward again, to the Canadian frontier. And here is where things become truly complex, because Arnold's next major operation, his invasion of Canada in the late fall of 1775, would be one of the most audacious, reckless, and ultimately tragic operations of the entire Revolutionary War. Arnold led roughly 1,100 men on a march that would take them through one of the harshest environments in North America. They moved through Maine, following the Kennebec River northward, then portaging overland toward Quebec City, which they intended to capture before the British could reinforce it. The operation was designed to disrupt the British supply lines, to spread American forces northward, and to prevent the British from using Canada as a launching point for invasions down the Hudson Valley and into the American colonies. It was an absolutely brutal march. Supplies ran short. Men contracted dysentery and pneumonia in the cold. 1 in 4 soldiers would not make it to Quebec. The unit that started with 1,100 men arrived with fewer than 700, and those who made it were barely capable of holding weapons, let alone launching an assault. And yet, against every rational assessment, Arnold attacked. The assault failed. It could not have succeeded with the forces he had, and Arnold himself was shot in the leg and had to be carried from the field. He was captured by the British, held as a prisoner of war, and then, in a prisoner exchange, he was returned to the Continental Army. That failure should have broken him. It should have ended his military career. Most commanders would have been blamed for the loss and sent to some secondary position. But Benedict Arnold possessed something that went beyond typical military talent. He possessed a kind of relentless energy, a refusal to accept limitation, that made him valuable to Washington even in failure. By 1777, Arnold had moved into a series of operations in the Hudson Valley. And this is where we begin to see the emergence of a commander whose tactical genius would save the revolution at its most critical moment. But before we get to that, and before we arrive at the moment that would define him forever, there is something you need to understand about how the Continental Congress and George Washington's government were treating Arnold. Arnold was, by every military measure, one of the most capable commanders in the Continental Army. His victories had been decisive and strategically important. His failures had been undertaken in pursuit of objectives that were strategically sound, even if tactically impossible. Yet despite this record, Arnold was passed over for promotion repeatedly. Other commanders, men with inferior combat records, were advanced above him. Younger men with better political connections received commissions that should have gone to Arnold. This injustice was not imaginary. It was real, systematic, and deliberate. The Continental Congress was filled with men who had their own political networks, their own state allegiances, their own reasons for favoring one officer over another. Benedict Arnold had no such network. He had no powerful patron in Congress. He had only his record, which apparently was not enough. And this is the beginning of the tragedy that would define his life. Because Arnold did not respond to this injustice the way a different person might have. By accepting it, by working harder to prove himself, by trusting that eventually recognition would come. No. Arnold responded the way a man responds when his pride has been struck, when his sense of being indispensable has been challenged. He began to believe that the government he was fighting for did not deserve his talent, did not recognize his value, and perhaps did not deserve to win at all. The letters he wrote during this period reveal a man whose resentment was metastasizing into something darker. He complained to Congress, he complained to Washington, he demanded back pay, he demanded recognition, he demanded acknowledgement of his sacrifices. Each letter grew more bitter, more demanding, more convinced that he alone understood what needed to be done to win this war. And each response from Congress, polite, bureaucratic, non-committal, felt like another wound. By 1778, Arnold had become a general in name only. His commissions were delayed, his promotions were questioned, his expenses were questioned. Meanwhile, younger officers with less combat experience were receiving honors, positions, and the kind of public recognition that Arnold had bled for. The injustice of it, real or imagined, consumed him entirely. When Washington appointed Arnold as military commander of Philadelphia after the British withdrew from the city in 1778, it seemed like vindication. Here was a position of real power, real prestige. Here was proof that Washington still valued him. Arnold moved into the finest house in Philadelphia, the Penn Mansion, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that things might be turning around. But Philadelphia was a city divided. The war had left deep scars. Loyalists and rebels lived side by side, watching each other with suspicion and hatred. The economy was fractured, supplies were scarce, profiteers and black marketeers controlled much of what little commerce existed, and Arnold, given command of this powder keg, began making decisions that would make him enemies he could not afford to make. He issued passes for merchants to trade goods. He requisitioned supplies for his own use. He conducted private business deals using his military authority. Were these acts of corruption or pragmatism? Historians still debate it, but in Philadelphia in 1778, they were acts of desperation by a man who believed the government owed him far more than it was paying. The complaints came quickly. Merchants accused him of abusing his authority. Local leaders petitioned Congress against him. Rival officers, smelling blood in the water, began circulating rumors that Arnold was profiting from the suffering of the city he was supposed to protect. By early 1779, a formal investigation was launched into his conduct in Philadelphia. Arnold demanded a court-martial to clear his name. He was convinced that a trial would vindicate him, that the evidence would prove his innocence, that justice would finally be served. What he did not anticipate was that the trial would take years to convene, and that waiting for vindication, watching his enemies consolidate their power against him, would break something inside him that could never be repaired. Before we continue, I need you to hold something in mind here. What we are watching is not the story of a traitor being born in a single moment of weakness. This is the story of a man being systematically destroyed by the institution he built. Every delay in his trial, every promotion denied, every letter ignored, these were the stones being laid in the foundation of what would become the greatest betrayal in American history. And here is where I have to pause and tell you something important. The complete breakdown of how military ambition can corrupt even the most capable officers, and how institutions can inadvertently create their own enemies, is something I explore in depth in my comprehensive guide on this topic, the ebook available in the description below and in the pinned comment. This guide takes you through the psychological framework that explains not just Arnold's fall, but the patterns of institutional failure that allowed it to happen. It is where the deeper analysis lives. If you want to understand how a hero becomes a traitor, you need to see those connections mapped out in detail. That guide is where that happens. In the spring of 1779, while his court-martial sat in limbo, Arnold made a decision that would change everything. He began to reach out to people he should never have trusted. He sent coded messages to British officers. He began to gather intelligence on American positions and movements. He started offering information that could only have come from someone with access to the highest levels of the Continental Army's command structure. The question that historians have wrestled with for nearly 250 years is this: at what exact moment did Arnold's resentment transform into treason? Was it a conscious decision, a line deliberately crossed, or was it a slow, gradual erosion of loyalty? A series of small compromises that eventually led to an incomprehensible act. Arnold himself, in his letters from this period, seems uncertain. He justifies his actions by claiming the cause was never as pure as he had believed. He tells himself that Congress does not deserve his loyalty. He tells himself that his military genius would be better appreciated by the British, who understood how to reward exceptional talent. By May of 1779, Arnold had made contact with the British through intermediaries. They were interested, very interested. A man of Arnold's position and knowledge could be worth an enormous sum. The British offered him money, enormous sums. They offered him a commission in the Royal Army. They offered him the recognition and prestige that America had denied him. All he had to do was give them something they desperately wanted: access to the American Army's command structure, and ultimately, the key to winning the war. Washington, utterly unaware of what was happening, still trusted Arnold completely. After Philadelphia, Arnold was assigned to West Point, the fortress on the Hudson River that had become the most strategically important position in all of America. The fort controlled the river. It contained supplies, ammunition, and intelligence. It was where Washington's plans were discussed. It was where the heart of American military power beat, and it was where Arnold, now a major general, had been given command. This was the moment the British had been waiting for. Arnold, in control of West Point, could hand them the key to victory. A British attack on the fortress, coordinated with Arnold's assistance, could potentially destroy the American Army's ability to defend New York. It could open a path for British forces to move freely through the colonies. It could, conceivably, end the war in British victory and American defeat. The plot took shape over the summer of 1780. Arnold would provide the British with detailed plans of West Point's defenses. He would weaken the garrison by removing key commanders. He would ensure that when the British attacked, the fortress would fall quickly and with minimal resistance. In exchange, he would receive £20,000, an enormous fortune at the time, and a commission as a general in the British Army. To communicate with the British, Arnold used an intermediary, a British spy and merchant named John Andre. Andre was young, charming, intelligent, and fluent in the language of espionage. He understood Arnold's resentments. He knew how to flatter a man's ego while simultaneously asking him to betray everything he had fought for. And over the course of months, Andre and Arnold developed what seemed almost like a friendship, built entirely on the foundation of treason. The communications between Arnold and Andre were conducted through coded letters, hidden messages, and carefully orchestrated meetings. They referred to Arnold as Monk in their correspondence, a name chosen to suggest spiritual contemplation, though there was nothing spiritual about what was being planned. Every message was a step closer to catastrophe. Every exchange of information was a betrayal of thousands of soldiers who trusted Arnold with their lives. And then, in September of 1780, something unexpected happened, something that would prevent Arnold from completing his act of betrayal. A British messenger carrying correspondence about the plot was captured by American militiamen. The documents were found on him. Within hours, the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed to Washington. The fortress was secure. The plot had failed. Arnold, realizing that discovery was imminent, had only one choice left. He fled. On the morning of September 25, 1780, with Washington riding toward West Point expecting breakfast with one of his most trusted generals, Benedict Arnold boarded a small boat on the Hudson River and rowed out to the British ship HMS Vulture, anchored in the river. He escaped to British-held territory. He left behind his reputation, his army, his country, and his place in history, trading it all for the promise of wealth and recognition that would never truly come. When Washington arrived at West Point that morning expecting breakfast with Arnold, he found instead a fortress in chaos, a commanding officer missing, and the damning evidence of a conspiracy that had nearly destroyed everything. The letters were spread before him. The scope of the plot became clear. For perhaps the only time in the entire war, witnesses reported that Washington came close to tears. Not tears of sadness, but tears of betrayal. The man he had trusted most, the officer he had called indispensable, had attempted to hand America's most strategic fortress to the British. Benedict Arnold had become what his name would forever mean in America, a traitor. But here is the secret I promised you at the beginning, the revelation that changes everything about how we understand this man and this moment. The story does not end with Arnold's escape. The real tragedy and the real complexity begins after he crosses that river. Thank you for staying with me through this critical moment in the story. If you have not already, please subscribe to Unbroken Regiment and leave a comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts on how you think Arnold's story should have ended differently. What would you have done in his position? That marks the conclusion of Part 2. The narrative has reached the moment of Arnold's escape and the revelation that more complexity is to come. Continue naturally in Part 3 without the closing farewell. What happened next was something few people in America have ever fully grasped. Benedict Arnold did not simply vanish into the shadow of history as a disgraced traitor. He reinvented himself. Within weeks of crossing the Hudson, Arnold was commissioned as a brigadier general in the British Army. The man who had bled for the American cause now wore the scarlet coat of King George. And worse, far worse, he was sent back to fight against the very soldiers he had once commanded. The irony was so bitter it could have poisoned generations. In December of 1780, just 3 months after his flight from West Point, Arnold led a British naval expedition up the Connecticut coast. His orders were to strike at New Haven and destroy American supply depots and warehouses. He knew these towns. He had walked their streets as a merchant, as a militia officer, as a man of standing. Now he was burning them. The British under his command raided New Haven's waterfront, sacked warehouses he had once owned or traded with, and terrorized the population of a place that had been his home. Reports came back to Washington describing a man possessed by a kind of fury, as if Arnold was trying to prove something not to the British, but to himself. One of those letters has survived in the British archives. In it, Arnold wrote to Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief, requesting permission to lead more aggressive raids. He wanted to strike deeper into Connecticut, to attack supply lines, to move toward the interior. The tone is almost desperate, as if he was trying to prove his value, to justify his price tag. £20,000 was a fortune, but it was also a weight. Arnold had to deliver victories now. He had to show results. The British had bought him, and he had to perform. But something unexpected happened in those raids along the Connecticut coast. The people of New Haven did not receive Arnold as a conqueror, or even as a defector. They received him as a traitor. Worse than that, they received him as a betrayer of their own. Years later, accounts would describe how townspeople who recognized Arnold would curse his name, how some tried to take shots at him as he rode through burning streets, how his own neighbors wanted him dead. One contemporary account suggests that Arnold's own mother, Hannah Watkins Arnold, while long dead, seemed to haunt those raids. The son she had raised after his father's humiliation was now committing his own form of public degradation. Only this time, it was not the humiliation of personal failure. It was the humiliation of national betrayal. Here is where we need to pause for a moment, because what comes next will change how you understand this entire story. Before we continue, I need you to hold something specific in your mind. This is crucial. Arnold's betrayal was not simply an act of greed or even an act of personal ambition. It was an act of spiritual death. And there is a reason why I am telling you that now. Because the man Arnold became after crossing that river was not the same man who had once led the attack on Fort Ticonderoga. He was a hollow version of himself. If you want to understand the deeper psychological mechanisms behind why men betray their own country, why loyalty breaks, and what it costs a soul to cross that line, I have prepared a complete guide to the psychology of military betrayal and the patterns that always precede it. You will find that guide in the description and pinned in the comment section below. It breaks down the warning signs that were visible in Arnold's life long before West Point, the pressure points that made him vulnerable, and the exact moment when his mind shifted from loyalty to disloyalty. This is the kind of deep analysis that takes months to research and write. It is a paid resource, but if you want to truly understand not just what Arnold did, but why he did it, and what any commander can learn from it, that guide will give you the keys you need. The rest of 1781 was a descent. Arnold continued his raids, but with diminishing returns. Washington moved quickly to minimize the damage. The American general understood that Arnold's value to the British was psychological more than tactical. If the Americans could deny Arnold victories, if they could make him ineffective, they could undermine the whole narrative that the British had purchased a great military mind. So Washington positioned forces to counter every move Arnold made. The raids continued, but they yielded fewer results. The British began to notice. The man they had paid £20,000 for was not delivering the spectacular victories they had promised themselves. His price tag was becoming a burden. In the private correspondence between Arnold and his British handlers, a new tone began to emerge. It was desperation masked as confidence. Arnold started requesting more resources, more men, more ships. He began to write about his long-term plans, about ways to strike more decisively at American supply lines and fortifications. But the response from London and from Clinton grew cooler. They had what they wanted from him, the betrayal itself. The symbolic victory of turning Washington's trusted general had already been won. Whether Arnold actually won battles on behalf of the crown was almost secondary. By the time the war effectively ended in 1781, after Yorktown, after the American victory had essentially already been secured, Arnold found himself in a curious position. He was no longer the traitor who had sold West Point. He was now a British officer who had failed to deliver on his promise. He had become disposable. The narrative that mattered, the one that Arnold had believed would make him a hero in British eyes, had evaporated. He had not turned the tide of the war. He had not destroyed the American Revolution. He had simply burned some warehouses in Connecticut and participated in a few minor raids along the coast. In the eyes of the British High Command, he was an expensive liability. When the peace treaty was signed in 1783, Arnold was offered a pension by the British government and quietly shuttled away to London. He was given a commission in the British Army and eventually posted to Canada, but never again did he hold a position of any real authority. The man who might have been the hero of the American Revolution had become a footnote in British military history. His name, which had once been spoken with respect in Continental Army circles, was now spoken with contempt and disgust. In America, his image was burned in effigy in the streets. Benedict Arnold became the American synonym for traitor, a word that has endured for over 240 years. His name is still used today to describe anyone who betrays their country, their cause, or their principles. But here is what most people miss about the end of Arnold's story. After the war, he tried to rebuild his life one more time. He moved to St. John in what is now New Brunswick, Canada, where he opened a merchant business and attempted to reclaim something of his old life. He married again, to Peggy Shippen, the woman who had been with him during his treachery. Together they had children and tried to establish themselves in this new place, in this foreign land, far from the country Arnold had once fought for and then betrayed. He spent his remaining years in a kind of self-imposed exile, never returning to America, never reconciling with the revolution he had helped to birth and then tried to destroy. The financial compensation Arnold received from the British was eventually supplemented by a pension, but it was not nearly the £20,000 he had been promised. The British Army, it turned out, was as unwilling to pay the full price for his betrayal as it was unwilling to acknowledge his service. Arnold had been bought and sold, used and discarded. He had betrayed his country for a price that the country he betrayed would never fully pay. The cruel mathematics of his decision had caught up with him. When he died in 1801, at the age of 60, he was buried with military honors, as a British officer deserved, but no one in his adopted land remembered who he had been or why he had come to be there. In America, his grave would have been desecrated. In Canada, it was simply forgotten. Yet the story of Benedict Arnold does not end with his death. In fact, in many ways, it only truly begins after he is gone. Because what Arnold's life teaches us about the nature of betrayal, ambition, and the fragile architecture of human loyalty has only become more relevant with time. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we believe, what we are willing to sacrifice for those beliefs, and what happens to a person's soul when they cross the line between loyalty and disloyalty. The question that historians have been asking for more than 2 centuries is this: was Arnold always destined to become a traitor, or was he betrayed by the very system that celebrated him? Was his decision to sell out the revolution an act of personal corruption, or was it the inevitable result of a man of extraordinary talent being treated as expendable by those in power? The answer, as is often the case with human beings, is more complicated than either option allows. It is both, it is neither. It is something far stranger and more tragic than simple betrayal. But here is the part of Arnold's story that changes everything. The revelation I promised you at the beginning. The man who nearly handed America to the British, the traitor whose name became synonymous with disloyalty for all of history, was simultaneously the commander most responsible for keeping the revolution alive long enough to succeed. This is not opinion. This is mathematical fact written in the blood spilled at Saratoga, in the fortifications he built, in the victories he orchestrated when no one else could. Arnold's genius, his absolute, undeniable military genius, saved the cause he would later betray. And that contradiction, that impossible duality, is the true weight of his story. Think about what that means for a moment. The British Army came into the Saratoga campaign in 1777 with overwhelming numerical advantage, professional soldiers, supply lines, and the backing of the world's greatest military power. They were supposed to crush the ragtag American forces. They were supposed to end the war in weeks. And they failed, not because Washington outmaneuvered them, but because Benedict Arnold saw something no one else saw. He understood terrain the way a musician understands music. He could read a landscape and know, instantly, where the British would be vulnerable, where an American attack would cascade into catastrophe for the enemy, where a single disciplined charge could turn 1,000 men into a rout. That is not luck. That is not circumstance. That is genius. But here is what nobody told Arnold at the time. His genius made him dangerous. Not to the British, to his own side. Men like Washington, men like Congress, men who held power through political connections rather than military brilliance, they began to see Arnold not as an asset, but as a threat. A commander who could read a battlefield better than anyone alive, who could make decisions in real time that defied conventional wisdom, who could inspire men to charge into impossible odds and somehow emerge victorious. Such a man could not be controlled. And in revolutionary organizations, especially those run by ambitious politicians who had never fired a shot, a man who cannot be controlled becomes a liability. The commissions went to politicians' sons and Washington's inner circle. The promotions went to men who played the game, who knew the right families, who understood how to navigate the Byzantine bureaucracy of the Continental Congress. Arnold got nothing. He won battles that saved the revolution, and Congress turned around and gave his rank to a man who had never commanded a platoon. They gave contracts to suppliers connected to committee members. They gave advancement to officers who had learned the art of politics more effectively than the art of war. Meanwhile, Arnold, whose victories had proven themselves in blood and fire, was passed over again and again and again. Some historians have tried to soften this reality to suggest that Arnold was simply ambitious, that he wanted wealth and status like any other man of his era, but that misses the point entirely. Arnold did not want comfort. He did not want luxury. What Arnold wanted, what burned inside him from his childhood onward, was acknowledgement. He wanted to be seen. He wanted his extraordinary abilities to be recognized and honored by the men he served. He wanted to know that his sacrifices, his wounds, his victories, his willingness to throw himself into the face of the British Army again and again had been noticed and valued by those in power. That is not greed. That is not treason waiting to happen. That is the most human need that exists, to be respected by the people you respect. And so when the British approached him in 1779, quietly, carefully, through intermediaries, offering him money and a commission, offering him the recognition he had earned and been denied, offering him a way out of the organization that had ground him down and cast him aside, Arnold made a choice. He did not make it immediately. He did not make it lightly. He wrestled with it for months. He knew what it meant. He knew the cost. But he had been betrayed first. That is the second part of this equation that history refuses to acknowledge. Arnold did not fall into betrayal from strength. He fell into it from exhaustion. He fell into it because every other path had been closed to him by the very government he had fought to create. The trial that followed his capture was perfunctory. The outcome was predetermined. The court-martial sentence was death, hanging, the death reserved for traitors. And on the morning of October 2nd, 1780, Benedict Arnold was led to the gallows. The man who had saved the revolution was about to be executed by the revolution. The man who had shown the Continental Army what true military genius looked like was about to pay the price for asking to be treated like a human being rather than a chess piece to be moved around a board. But wait, this is where the story takes one final turn, because Washington, in an act of mercy that historians have debated for centuries, commuted Arnold's sentence. Not out of forgiveness, not out of weakness, but because Washington understood something that everyone else had missed. Arnold had tried to trade West Point to the British for money and a commission. Yes, but the conspiracy had failed. The plot had been discovered before any damage could be done. And Washington, the man Arnold had tried to betray, recognized that executing Arnold would not serve justice. It would serve only as a final humiliation to a man who had already been humiliated enough. It would be killing him not for his crimes, but for his pain. So Arnold was allowed to live. He was exchanged as a prisoner of war, made a general in the British Army, given, at last, the rank and recognition he had been denied by the Americans. He served out the rest of the war in British uniform, never fired upon by American soldiers again, never required to face the gallows that had been prepared for him. And in the years that followed, he lived in obscurity, first in Canada, then in England, a man whose name had become poison on both sides of the Atlantic. The British did not trust him. He was, after all, a traitor to his own country, a man who had proven himself capable of betraying everything. The Americans hated him. He had attempted to sell them out. He had proven that no sacrifice was too much to expect, no betrayal too large to commit, if a man felt sufficiently wounded by those in power. He died in 1801, friendless and forgotten, in a small apartment in London. The man who had nearly changed the course of American history expired with almost no one taking notice. His funeral was attended by a handful of people. His grave, initially unmarked, eventually received a stone that mentioned only his rank and the date of his death. Not his victories, not his genius, not the battles he had won, not the fortifications he had built, not the thousands of British soldiers he had kept from overrunning the revolution. Just his name and his dates. That is all history permitted him. But here is the truth that ties everything together. The revelation I promised you at the beginning. Benedict Arnold's betrayal was not inevitable. It was not the unavoidable result of his ambition or his corruption. It was the direct result of a system that took extraordinary men, used them to their absolute limit, and then discarded them the moment they became inconvenient. Arnold tried to betray the revolution because the revolution had first betrayed him. He attempted to hand America to the British because America had already handed him over to obscurity and disrespect. The tragedy is not that Arnold turned traitor. The tragedy is that the Continental Congress and the political structure of the new nation created the conditions that made betrayal seem like the only path forward for a man of his stature. This is not to excuse Arnold's betrayal. Betrayal is betrayal, and the consequences of his actions could have been catastrophic. But it is to recognize that history has been unfair to him in a different way, not by condemning him too harshly, but by failing to ask the harder questions. Why did a military genius feel so desperate, so abandoned, so utterly without hope, that he was willing to trade his entire legacy for the promise of recognition from the enemy? What does that tell us about how we treat our heroes? What does that tell us about what happens when a system celebrates sacrifice in the moment and then discards the sacrifice the moment the battle is over? The real betrayal of the American Revolution was not what Arnold did to the revolution. It was what the revolution did to Arnold. It took a man of extraordinary genius, asked him to sacrifice everything, promised him honor and recognition, and then, when he had delivered that sacrifice and won those battles, turned away. It told him his achievements did not matter. It told him his wounds meant nothing. It told him that the political class's connections mattered more than his genius. And in the end, it told him that he was not valued, not respected, not honored, not seen. And when a person of that caliber, someone with that much to offer, comes to believe that they are not valued by those in power, what do you expect them to do? What would any of us do? The challenge I want to leave you with this week is simple but profound. In your own life, in your own leadership, in the ways you interact with people who work alongside you or serve under you, ask yourself this question: am I treating the people around me as though they matter? Am I acknowledging their sacrifices? Am I seeing them, truly seeing them? Or am I only looking at what they can do for me? Because the tragedy of Benedict Arnold is not that he was a traitor, it is that he was a man of genius who was made to feel invisible. And invisibility, for a person of that stature, becomes a kind of death. Do not be the one who makes someone feel that way. Be the one who sees. Thank you for staying with me through this complicated, often uncomfortable story of one of America's most misunderstood figures. If this exploration of forgotten heroes, those whose sacrifices were remembered and those whose genius was overlooked, resonates with you, please subscribe to Unbroken Regiment and activate the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next untold story of courage and consequence. And if you have your own story of someone whose contribution was overlooked, whose sacrifice was forgotten, I would genuinely love to hear it. Leave a comment below. That is how we keep these stories alive. End of part 4/end of script.